There are photographs that should never see the light of day. Images so haunting that even seasoned doctors debate if showing them would violate the very dignity of humanity. In the remote mountains of Appalachia, 1971, a 17-year-old girl was carried into a small rural hospital, unconscious and barely clinging to life. Hours later, she would give birth to something that defied science, morality, and every law of nature. It wasn't just the product of incest. It was the final chapter in a century-long experiment hidden in the shadows of an isolated family who believed they were chosen, pure, untouchable. For 6 days, this child existed. It breathed, it watched, it learned. And when it died, it left behind not only a devastated family, but government files so disturbing they were locked away for 50 years. Tonight, we're opening those files, and by the time this story ends, you may wish they had stayed buried. Before we dive deeper, take a second to hit that like button. It really helps this channel keep uncovering stories the world wants forgotten. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next, and share this video with someone who thinks they've heard it all. Trust me, they haven't. It was just after dawn on October 13, 1971, when the glass doors of Mercy General Hospital burst open. A group of men, thick-shouldered, dressed in worn flannel and mud-caked boots, pushed a makeshift stretcher through the emergency ward. On it lay a girl, limp and pale, her chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. Her hair clung to her damp forehead in dark strands, and the loose hospital gown someone had thrown over her could barely disguise the fact that her belly bulged unnaturally high and round. 17-year-old Sarah Mae Whitaker was deep in labor, but this was no ordinary birth. Even before the nurses rushed forward, something in the air shifted, like the room had been cut off from the outside world. The men spoke little, their Appalachian drawl thick and guarded, but the urgency in their eyes told the staff everything they needed to know. This delivery could not wait. The attending physician that morning, Dr. Margaret Powell, had been on call for nearly 18 hours, but the moment she saw the girl's face, her fatigue evaporated. Sarah Mae's skin was almost translucent, veins tracing dark, restless patterns beneath it. Her lips had the bluish tint of someone in oxygen distress, yet her pulse was unnervingly fast. Powell ordered the stretcher toward the delivery suite, but the men didn't move at first. They hesitated, exchanging looks, as though crossing that threshold meant surrendering something they weren't ready to give up. When they finally stepped aside, it wasn't out of trust. It was necessity. One of them, a weathered man with deep lines etched into his face, locked eyes with Dr. Powell and muttered, "Make sure it's all written down." She would later remember that sentence more vividly than anything else she heard that day. In the delivery room, the atmosphere thickened with tension. Nurses prepped equipment while trying and failing not to stare at Sarah Mae's distended abdomen. It wasn't just the size. It was the movement beneath the skin. Instead of the familiar rolling or kicking motions of a fetus, there were sharp, wave-like pulses, almost rhythmic, like something alive and deliberate was pushing against the barrier of her body. Powell's instincts screamed that she was looking at an emergency case, but there was a deeper unease, a sense that whatever was inside this girl was different. The fetal monitor seemed to agree. It refused to produce a steady heartbeat, spitting out irregular bursts that looked more like brainwave patterns than any cardiac rhythm she'd ever seen. The sound from the speakers was not the soft gallop of life, but a faint, almost whispering static. As contractions intensified, Sarah Mae didn't cry out. She couldn't. She had been unconscious for 3 days, according to the men who brought her in, her body already ravaged by whatever was growing inside. Her hair had thinned to the point of near baldness, her teeth loose in her gums, and the yellowish hue of her eyes, when they flickered open for a brief second, was something Dr. Powell had never seen in a human being. The medical team exchanged worried glances, but the family standing just outside the door watched with an almost feverish anticipation. One of the older women clutched a bundle of cloth against her chest, rocking slightly, as if preparing to swaddle something precious. Their faces were not marked by fear, but by something stranger: pride. By mid-morning, the delivery had begun in earnest, the room filled with the raw sound of human struggle, the hiss of oxygen, the low hum of machines, the barked commands of doctors and nurses. But beneath it all, there was something else, a low, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to emanate from the girl herself. Powell couldn't place it, and the nurses later disagreed on whether they had truly heard it at all. What they all agreed on, however, was the feeling it gave them. Like the hospital room was no longer in Virginia, no longer bound by the same rules they'd lived by their whole lives. Something was coming, and none of them, doctor, nurse, or kin, were prepared for what would arrive before the day was done. Long before Sarah May was carried through those hospital doors, the Whitaker family had already sealed themselves off from the rest of the world. Their home was high in the Appalachian hills, where the roads turned to gravel, then to dirt, then to little more than deer paths swallowed by trees. Outsiders rarely came that far, and those who did often left with the same story. Voices singing in the night, lantern lights weaving through the forest, and eyes watching from behind curtains. The Whitakers were polite enough if you met them in town, but they came down so rarely that most locals spoke of them the way one might speak of a ghost story, half believed, half feared. They were, as one old shopkeeper put it, a family apart, and just fine keeping it that way. Their roots went back to 1847, when Joshua Whitaker claimed a rough stretch of mountain land no one else wanted. The soil was poor, the winters long, and the nearest neighbor was 3 days' ride. That was exactly how Joshua liked it. He had come with 2 women, his legal wife, Martha, and her younger sister, Rebecca, whom he also claimed under the lax frontier law of the time. The local preacher, grateful for any congregation at all, blessed both unions. By 1855, Joshua had 14 children, all of them Whitakers by name and blood. But when those children grew up, they didn't marry into neighboring families. They married each other. What began as an unusual choice soon hardened into a tradition, and from there, into something far more calculated. Family journals, found decades later hidden beneath the rotting floorboards of the original homestead, revealed that Joshua believed mixing bloodlines weakened the soul. He preached that God had placed a divine essence in their family, one that must remain untainted at all costs. Blood calls to blood, the journals read. It is the circle that makes us whole. By the 1880s, the family tree was no longer a tree at all. It was a knotted, looping vine where cousins, siblings, and even uncles and nieces became husband and wife. The children born of these unions often carried strange traits: silent dispositions, unsteady gaits, eyes that seemed to look past you rather than at you. Locals whispered about a curse. The Whitakers called it purity. By the early 20th century, the practice had evolved into what they chillingly referred to as the rotation system. Each fertile woman would bear children to multiple male relatives in a strict order, documented in meticulous handwritten ledgers. It was less a family and more a breeding program, the kind you might expect for livestock, not human beings. Sarah May's grandmother, Charity, was the product of 3 different fathers: her own father, her father's brother, and her uncle. Geneticists, decades later, would call her DNA impossible, a pattern of inbreeding so extreme it defied known biological rules. And yet, within the Whitakers' isolated world, she thrived, believing the outside world to be full of mongrel blood and unworthy of comparison. By the time Sarah May was born in the 1960s, the Whitakers had been isolated for more than a century. They had their own dialect, their own rituals, and a worldview that saw outsiders not just as different, but as dangerous contaminants. Marriages, births, and even deaths happened without a whisper reaching the town below. Outsiders were met with silence, or, if they persisted, with violence. In this closed loop of blood and belief, Sarah May grew up knowing nothing of what most would call normal. She was, from birth, part of a grand design. And when her third pregnancy began, the elders whispered it could be the culmination they had been waiting for. The Whittakers didn't just stumble into inbreeding. They engineered it. By the mid-20th century, what had begun as marriages between siblings and cousins had transformed into a deliberate, almost scientific process they called the pure line. To them, this wasn't depravity, it was destiny. Each generation was a step toward what they believed would be a perfect human form, a body and mind untouched by the corruptive mixing of outside blood. They recorded every union, every birth defect, every early death, as though they were charting a breeding experiment in a hidden laboratory. To an outsider, their records were chillingly clinical. To them, they were sacred scripture. The rotation system was the backbone of this mission. Women weren't simply wives, they were bearers of the next iteration in the genetic plan. Men didn't compete for partners. They were assigned, based on calculations made by the family elders. If a child was born with physical anomalies, it was seen as either a step forward or a necessary sacrifice. If the child didn't survive, it was mourned, but also recorded as part of the circle's refining. The language in the ledgers was both reverent and cold, offering to the blood. Born flawed, purity not yet reached. These were not private musings. They were read aloud at family gatherings like a priest might recite scripture at a mass. Sarah May's own parents embodied the extreme outcome of this philosophy. Her father was, by technical definition, also her uncle and her cousin. Her mother's ancestry looped so tightly back into the Whitaker line that a geneticist would later say her DNA folded in on itself. Yet within the compound, this was celebrated. The elders told Sarah May from the time she could speak that she carried the strongest blood of her generation. By age 14, she was already part of the rotation system, giving birth to her first child, a baby so severely malformed it died within hours. The family didn't hide it from her. They gathered, sang, and called the death an offering. Her second child followed at 16 with the same tragic outcome. Each loss was framed as part of the greater plan. But her third pregnancy, this one, was different from the beginning. The moment her belly began to swell, the whispers started. The elders visited her room daily, laying hands on her stomach and murmuring prayers in their strange dialect. They told her she was carrying the culmination, the one they had waited for across 5 generations. This child, they said, would be more than human, a sign that the circle was finally complete. Sarah May didn't understand the full weight of their words, but she understood their intensity. She was kept inside, shielded from the cold mountain air, fed a strict diet of what the elders called purity foods, and made to participate in nightly rituals where smoke filled the air and strange symbols were drawn on her skin with ash. By her 7th month, it became clear even to Sarah May that this was no normal pregnancy. Her belly stretched so far it seemed her skin might tear. The movements inside weren't the occasional kicks she'd felt before. They were waves, deliberate and rhythmic, like something pressing outward in patterns. Her skin grew so thin that the veins beneath it were visible, pulsing in dark, writhing networks. Her hair came out in handfuls. Her teeth loosened. Her once warm brown eyes turned an eerie, pale yellow that seemed almost to catch light in the dark. To her family, these were signs of transformation, proof that the child was something extraordinary. To anyone else, they were signs of a body being poisoned from within. By the 8th month, Sarah May could no longer walk without help. Her legs trembled under the sheer weight of her distended abdomen, and every step left her gasping for air. Yet the Whitaker elders treated her condition not as an emergency, but as a sacred trial. They moved her into the old parlor room of the main house, its curtains drawn tight to keep out prying eyes. Candles replaced lamps. The air inside was thick with the sweet, acrid smell of burning herbs, a haze that clung to the walls and soaked into her skin. At night, the family gathered around her bed, chanting low, repetitive phrases in their private dialect. Sometimes she could feel the baby respond, its strange, undulating movements aligning with the rhythm of their voices, almost as if it understood. The changes in Sarah May's body grew more alarming. Her weight dropped sharply, even as her stomach swelled larger than anyone had seen. Her bones stood out along her collar and hips, her skin so pale it took on a waxen sheen. The veins on her abdomen seemed to shift of their own accord, curling and uncurling like living things beneath the surface. Sometimes, in the flicker of candlelight, she thought she saw shapes moving inside her. Not limbs, but something more fluid, almost serpentine. When she whispered these fears to her grandmother, Charity, the older woman only smiled, brushing Sarah May's damp hair back from her forehead. "That's the blood completing itself," she said softly. "It's beautiful." By early October, Sarah May began slipping in and out of consciousness for hours at a time. The elders took this as another sign, the body preparing itself for the culmination. Her breathing grew shallow, her lips cracked, and a faint yellow hue spread across her skin, matching the strange glow in her eyes. The family kept meticulous notes on every change, each entry logged in the same leather-bound ledger that had recorded generations of births and deaths. But what they didn't write down, what only Sarah May felt, was the constant, heavy presence of the child inside her. It wasn't just growing. It was active in a way she couldn't explain. It would press hard against her ribs, hold there for several seconds, then shift to another spot as though mapping her from the inside. The final week before her labor began was marked by an eerie quiet in the house. The elders stopped chanting and began working in silence, moving Sarah May's bed to face east, lining the walls with objects from the family's history, old photographs, twisted pieces of wood carved into spiral shapes, jars of murky liquid with unidentifiable contents. They dressed her in a long white gown that had been stored away for years, its hem embroidered with looping circular symbols. It was the same gown her mother had worn during her final pregnancy, and her grandmother before her. Sarah May was too weak to protest, too weak to do anything but breathe and listen to the constant hum in her ears, a sound she could no longer tell was coming from inside her head or from the child itself. On the morning of October 13th, Sarah May's body finally gave way. She collapsed into unconsciousness during a coughing fit, her family unable to wake her. Only then did they decide to take her to a hospital, not out of fear for her life, but to ensure there would be official witnesses to the birth they had been waiting for across 5 generations. As they carried her down the mountain, bundled in blankets against the cold, the men moved with grim determination, while the women followed behind, clutching bundles and jars as though they were relics. In the valleys below, people still spoke of that caravan, how it moved through the mist in silence, a living shadow bringing with it something no one could ever truly prepare for. The delivery began before the hospital staff could even settle into a rhythm. Sarah May's body convulsed in violent waves, each contraction lasting longer than the last, as if something inside her was resisting the very act of being born. Dr. Powell had delivered thousands of babies, but she could tell instantly this was no ordinary labor. The fetal monitor refused to cooperate, printing jagged, irregular bursts that looked more like seismic readings than a heartbeat. The sound coming through the speakers wasn't the familiar gallop of new life. It was low, stuttering, and disturbingly close to a whisper. Nurses exchanged wary glances, unsure whether the interference was mechanical or something else entirely. Outside the delivery room, the Whitaker family gathered in a dense wall of silence. They refused to sit. They stood with their backs straight, their hands clasped in front of them, eyes fixed on the door like parishioners waiting for a sign from their god. The older women mouthed silent prayers, their lips moving in unison. From time to time, one of the men would glance toward the delivery room window, his expression unreadable. They didn't flinch at Sarah May's muffled cries or the calls for more suction. They were waiting for something specific, something they believed was promised to them long before this day. Inside, the room felt suffocating. The air was heavy with the metallic tang of blood and antiseptic, underscored by that faint hum still emanating from somewhere, whether from Sarah May or from what she carried, no one could say. Hours dragged on. At one point, her contractions were so violent they shattered 2 of her ribs, the crack audible over the chaos. Yet she remained unconscious, her face slack, her breathing shallow but steady, as if she were trapped in a place between life and death. Dr. Powell's team worked in terse bursts, suctioning, adjusting, urging the child into the world. None of them spoke about the strange shapes that shifted beneath Sarah May's stretched skin, though everyone saw them. When the moment finally came, it was met not with the sharp cry of a newborn, but with complete silence. The infant, if that word even applied, slid into the doctor's hands, its skin slick and pale, its form wrong. Its head was grotesquely large, the skull so translucent that the pulsing brain inside was visible, but not shaped like any human brain, more like dozens of small, separate knots of tissue, each moving independently. The limbs emerged at unnatural angles, ending in hands with too many fingers spiraling outward and legs twisted together like vines. Where feet should have been were tiny, malformed faces, eyes blinking, mouths opening and closing without sound. Most haunting of all was the main face, or rather the 3 faces, overlapping and sharing features in a way that created an expression of perpetual, silent screaming. Dr. Powell froze. For a moment, so did the entire room. One nurse stepped back, her hand over her mouth. Another gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. No one spoke. No one moved. And then, the faintest sound, a soft, vibrating hum, filled the air, emanating from the newborn's chest. The Whittakers outside must have heard it too, because the moment it reached their ears, their rigid silence broke. A murmur swelled among them, and one of the elder women began to weep, not in grief, but in joy. For them, the culmination had arrived. For the rest of the world, it was the start of a nightmare. The child was not expected to survive the night. Every principle of medicine insisted that such severe deformities were incompatible with life, and yet hour after hour it continued to breathe, slow, deliberate breaths, each one accompanied by that faint, vibrating hum. It never cried. Not once. Instead, it made a sound somewhere between the static of a detuned radio and the low resonance of a tuning fork, a noise that seemed to thrum in the bones of anyone who stood too close. Nurses whispered about it in the break room, their voices low as if afraid the child could somehow hear them from the nursery. None of them wanted to be alone with it, yet none could resist stealing glances through the glass. The Whitaker family established a constant vigil at the incubator. They spoke to the child in their private dialect, their voices melodic, almost sing-song. The newborn's multiple eyes tracked them independently, one set following the movements of an elder's hands, another fixed on a cousin's face. Most unsettling of all was the sense of recognition. When a particular family member approached, the child's breathing pattern would shift, its hum deepening as though it knew them. The staff began to notice strange objects appearing beside the incubator. Pieces of twisted wood, flat stones arranged in spirals, small jars filled with cloudy liquid. Whenever Dr. Powell ordered these removed, they would reappear by the next morning. Medical observation revealed phenomena no one could explain. The brain, visible through its translucent skull, pulsed in distinct, asynchronous rhythms, as if multiple centers of thought were operating independently. Reflex tests produced inconsistent results. Sometimes a touch would trigger no reaction at all. Other times the response was unnervingly precise, like a deliberate choice. One night, Nurse Patricia Williams swore she saw the child's 3 faces move in different expressions at once, one smiling faintly, one grimacing, and one utterly still. She told no one but Dr. Powell, who simply nodded, her expression unreadable. The medical charts filled with notes that looked more like field reports than patient records. By the 3rd day, its physical condition began to change. Dark patches formed beneath the skin, spreading slowly like ink in water. The doctors assumed this was organ failure, the inevitable collapse of a body not built to survive. But instead of distress, the child seemed calmer. Its overlapping faces softened, the constant tension easing into something eerily close to contentment. The Whittakers whispered that this was a sign. The culmination was preparing for its final form. They began performing their rituals more openly, singing in low harmonies that seemed to sync with the child's hum, creating a layered vibration in the room that made even the hospital walls seem to resonate. On the 6th morning, the day shift arrived to find something they would never forget. During the night, the child's fused limbs had bent into a position that should have been physically impossible. Its body formed a perfect spiral, each segment of its twisted frame aligning into a pattern that several staff later swore resembled ancient symbols, though none could agree on which ones. The 3 faces all bore the same faint, closed-eyed smile. And then, without a sound, the breathing stopped. The hum faded into silence. The culmination, as the Whittakers called it, was gone. But for those who had witnessed its short life, the real weight was not in its passing. It was in the unshakable feeling that it had left with intention, as if completing a task no one else could understand. When Dr. Powell entered the nursery that morning, the room was unnervingly still. The usual low hum of machines and quiet shuffle of nurses' shoes seemed to have vanished. All eyes were fixed on the incubator, where the child lay in its impossible pose. The spiral it had formed was perfect, too perfect. Every fused limb bent at sharp yet fluid angles, every joint locked into place as though the body had been sculpted rather than born. The curve began at the crown of its grotesquely enlarged head, winding inward until the tiny malformed faces at what should have been its feet completed the loop. The pattern was mesmerizing. Powell found herself tracing it with her eyes again and again, caught in a strange, almost hypnotic rhythm. The Whitaker family crowded in silently behind her, their boots squeaking faintly on the polished floor. They didn't gasp or cry. They didn't speak. They simply stood in reverence, their eyes wide, their lips trembling as if on the verge of prayer. One of the elders stepped forward, her hands clasped over her chest, and whispered something in their dialect, low, deliberate, and full of meaning that no one else in the room could understand. Another man pulled a tattered notebook from inside his coat and began sketching the spiral with astonishing speed, his hands steady despite the emotion on his face. To them, this was no tragedy. This was revelation. Powell, shaken but determined, tried to remove the body for examination. That's when she realized just how unnatural the position was. The joints didn't resist movement because of rigor mortis. It hadn't set in yet. The resistance felt different, almost as though the body was holding itself there. When she tried to gently unfurl one of the twisted limbs, an audible creak, not of bone, but of something denser, sounded from within, and the entire spiral seemed to tighten imperceptibly. The nurses exchanged uneasy looks. One muttered a quiet, "Jesus," before stepping back, her face pale. No one touched it again. Word of the spiral began to spread within the hospital, despite the Whittakers' constant hovering presence. A surgical tech claimed he recognized the pattern from an old anthropology textbook, something about pre-Columbian symbols tied to fertility rituals. Another swore she'd seen it in a book of Appalachian folk magic linked to closing the circle and binding a spirit within. Dr. Powell didn't know what to believe. All she knew was that every time she looked at it, a pressure began to build behind her eyes, a dull ache that only eased when she forced herself to turn away. The family, however, stared without flinching, murmuring to each other like parishioners watching a holy relic. By the afternoon, the spiral had begun to change. The dark patches beneath the child's translucent skin deepened, creeping along the curve like a slow tide. The Whittakers called this the ceiling, their voices tinged with awe. Then, just as suddenly, the body slackened, the limbs loosened, the spiral unraveled, and the malformed frame lay limp in the incubator. The room seemed to exhale. Whatever force had held it together was gone. Powell ordered the body prepared for autopsy, though in her gut she knew the truth. The most disturbing thing about the spiral was not that it had formed, it was the sense that it had been intentional, a final act by something that had understood exactly what it was doing. The first black sedans arrived less than 2 hours after the child's death. They rolled into the gravel parking lot without sirens or flashing lights, their tinted windows reflecting only the pale October sky. Men in dark suits stepped out, clean-shaven, expressionless, their polished shoes leaving sharp imprints in the damp ground. They carried slim briefcases and moved with an unhurried, practiced precision, as if they already knew exactly where they were going. The hospital staff expected some kind of introduction, credentials, maybe even a warning about media attention. Instead, the man in front simply said, "We're here for the Whitaker case," in a tone that left no room for questions. Within minutes, the entire wing was locked down. A pair of suited men stationed themselves at each entrance to the maternity ward, while others moved directly to the nursery. Dr. Powell tried to assert her authority as lead physician, but the man in charge, a tall figure with an unblinking stare, handed her a sealed folder and said, "Sign these, and you will not speak of what you've seen." The documents were non-disclosure agreements, written in dense legal language that promised severe consequences for any breach. Powell glanced at the line where her signature was expected and hesitated, but the man's silence felt heavier than any threat he could have spoken aloud. She signed. So did every nurse, orderly, and technician who had been within earshot of the delivery. The agents worked quickly, their movements almost choreographed. They took the child's body first, lifting it with surprising gentleness before placing it in a black, zipperless bag made of some material the staff had never seen. It didn't crinkle like plastic or flex like cloth. It seemed to absorb light, the outline of the body inside barely visible. Then they collected the medical records, photographs, and even the fetal monitor strips, sliding each into secure metal cases. One agent gathered the strange objects the Whittakers had brought, the spiral stones, the carved wood, the jars with their cloudy contents, handling them as though they were radioactive. The Whitaker family did not resist. They stood silently as their so-called culmination was taken away, their expressions unreadable. But there was no grief in their faces, only a strange, serene resolve, as if this had been expected. One of the elders approached the lead agent and handed him a folded scrap of paper. He opened it, glanced at what was written inside, and tucked it into his pocket without a word. No one ever learned what was on it. Then, without ceremony, the family turned and left the hospital together, moving as one, disappearing into the mist outside like they had never been there at all. By the time the agents were done, there was no trace the child had ever existed. The incubator was sterilized and removed. The delivery records were replaced with a single bland entry in the hospital's log. Infant expired due to multiple congenital anomalies. The official paperwork for Sarah May's death, which occurred 3 days later, was equally unremarkable, attributing her passing to complications from childbirth. There was nothing in writing to suggest that either event was unusual, and yet the air in Mercy General felt different after that day. Heavier, quieter, as though the building itself remembered what had happened and was choosing not to speak of it. For 50 years, the Whitaker case lay buried in government archives, its details locked away under layers of classification so dense that even seasoned investigators assumed it was a dead end. When the files were quietly declassified in 2021, almost no one noticed. There was no press conference, no announcement, just a silent upload into an obscure federal database buried among thousands of unrelated documents. It wasn't until a retired journalist researching Appalachian folklore stumbled across the file name Rowan Oak. Subject, Whitaker lineage, that its contents began to surface. What he found inside was far worse than any local legend. The report began clinically with blood tests, genetic charts, and photographs stamped Restricted Level 5. The language was cold, detached, but the data was anything but ordinary. The child's DNA contained sequences that did not match any recorded human genome, not mutations, not random anomalies, but precise, repeating patterns as if engineered. Even more disturbing, the sequences appeared in earlier Whitaker generations as well, gradually increasing in concentration over time. One analyst wrote in the margin of a lab report, "Not accidental. This is a formula." That single note, handwritten in red ink, seemed to echo through the rest of the file like a warning no one had heeded. The genealogical section was even more chilling. The Whitaker family's rotation system wasn't just an inbred tradition, it followed a strict mathematical pattern. Generations of pairings were arranged with the kind of precision you'd expect from a long-term breeding experiment. The report concluded that this was unlikely to be the work of uneducated rural farmers. Someone, at some point, had introduced and maintained a complex genetic plan spanning over a century, but the files never said who or why. A heavily redacted page hinted at outside influence during the late 1800s, suggesting that Joshua Whitaker, the family patriarch, may not have devised the system alone. The source of that influence was blacked out entirely. Photographic evidence filled another section. Grainy black and white images of Whitaker children born across decades. Some showed minor deformities, others far more severe, with features so unusual they looked sculpted rather than grown. The final photographs were of Sarah May's child, high-resolution color images taken from multiple angles, each stamped with the date and time, each more unsettling than the last. The spiral position in which the child had died was preserved in vivid detail, with measurements and sketches beside it. One diagram overlaid the spiral with an ancient symbol known to appear in both Celtic and Appalachian folk magic, annotated with the question, "Coincidence?" The last page of the report was short, just a single paragraph that felt like a closing statement. The Whitaker case suggests intentional genetic experimentation spanning multiple generations, conducted by unknown parties for unknown purposes. The family's isolation and systematic breeding program indicate a level of organization and long-term planning that exceeds what would be expected from isolated rural populations. Further investigation is recommended to determine if similar programs exist elsewhere. And then, in smaller type, one last sentence, no further investigation authorized. The file ended there without explanation, as if the case had simply been dropped into the void. But if that was the end, it left one question that no report could bury. If the Whitakers were one experiment, how many others are still out there? Even after the files were declassified, no official agency stepped forward to address what they revealed. The Whitakers had vanished from public record, their mountain homestead left to rot, their name reduced to whispers in Appalachian towns. And yet in those same hills, people still claim to hear voices singing on windless nights, see lanterns weaving through the trees where no road existed. Hunters told of stumbling upon spiral patterns etched into the dirt, fresh and deliberate, in places miles from the nearest trail. Always there was the same advice. Don't follow the lights and don't ask questions you're not prepared to have answered. The deeper one digs, the more the Whitaker story begins to look less like an isolated horror and more like a single thread in a much larger weave. The government file hinted at similar programs without naming them, but independent researchers began comparing notes, unearthing strange parallels in places as far apart as the Ozarks, the Alaskan interior, and the Nevada desert. In each case, there were rumors of isolated families with unusual physical traits, rigid breeding customs, and an almost religious fixation on purity. The similarities were too exact to dismiss as coincidence. Someone, or something, had been cultivating these pockets of human isolation for generations. Folklorists have long collected stories of the perfect blood or the circle, whispered legends about people who believe their lineage holds the key to something beyond human limits. Most dismiss them as cautionary tales or regional superstitions. But after the Whitaker revelations, some began to reconsider. The spiral, in particular, emerged as a recurring motif, scratched into old barn walls, carved into headstones, even found in the designs of quilts passed down for 100 years. In some cases, these symbols appeared in places where no one alive could explain their origin. They were just there, as if waiting for someone to notice. And then there are the disappearances. Small, scattered, easily dismissed when viewed individually, a missing hiker here, a runaway teenager there. But in certain counties, especially in the remote Appalachians, patterns emerge. People vanish near areas long avoided by locals. Their last known locations marked by strange ground disturbances or sightings of figures standing silently in the tree line. No bodies are found, no evidence is recovered. Just absence, as clean and deliberate as the erasure of the Whitaker records. Those who study these cases have a name for the phenomenon: the quiet harvest. In the end, the Whitaker case may not be the story of a single family at all, but a glimpse into something older, wider, and far more deliberate. A network of hidden lineages working toward purposes the outside world isn't meant to understand. Whether those purposes are scientific, spiritual, or something stranger is a question no one seems eager to answer. What is certain is this: Sarah May's child was not a mistake. It was a culmination, and somewhere, in another forgotten hollow, on another cold October morning, another family could be waiting for their turn. If the spiral means what the Whitakers believed it did, then the circle hasn't closed. Not yet.